I'm Dr. Bill Bass. I would like to welcome you to the first of a series of 4 lectures dealing with techniques and identification of human skeletal material. I'd like to start off by going to the laboratory and showing the first steps that occur when a skeleton is found by law enforcement agents or by hunters or somebody like this and is brought in to be identified. We have a skeleton here that's just been found out on the edge of the interstate. The police have brought this in and asked us to determine the age, the race, the sex, the stature, handedness, the manner of death, any other thing that we might be able to determine to help identify this unknown individual. One of the first things that you should always do when you have skeletal remains is you should place them in anatomical order, and you see that we have placed the skeleton in anatomical order. You will note that there are no hands and feet on this individual. The reason for this is that this individual has been out long enough for the animals to get to the hands and feet and carry them off, so we have only the major bones of the body. Another reason for putting an individual in anatomical order, a skeleton in anatomical order, is that you want to determine if there are more than one individual involved. You will note here that there is only a single individual, that there are no duplicates of any of the major bones of the body. This body has been out on the ground roughly about 7 or 8 months. You will note some dry tissue on the side of the skull. This is one of the means that we use of determining how long an individual has been dead when they're at the stage where you have only skeletal remains left. Note on the face a couple of things. You will see a greenish stain right here. This is copper staining, some type of copper lying close to the body as it was decaying, and this may be a bullet. I'm going to show you in just a little while lead splatter in the skull. You'll note that the face is broken, and we have reconstructed this. There appears to have been a gunshot to the lower left side of the skull. We can show you this in another way. This is the mandible or lower jaw, and you will note a section out of the mandible here. This is on the left side of the mandible, and the bullet was fired probably from the back, with the bullet coming out and taking this section of bone out toward the front. Note also that there is lead splatter in the clavicle. This is the left clavicle, and you will note here a splinter, and you can actually see some metallic object right there if you look at this close enough, and we'll show you this on the x-ray view box in just a minute because we x-rayed this to see what it was, and indeed it is lead. And you will note also from the left scapula, this is the left scapula, the bone in the back, and you will see at least 2 bullet holes in the scapula, one here and one here, with subsequent fracturing of the bone. Now let's walk down and take a look at some of the x-rays that were taken so that we can determine what happened to this individual. You will note here in the x-ray of the skull a few light areas right here and a number of smaller ones in this area. This is lead splatter caused by the bullet fragmenting and leaving the fragments in the skull. Moving down to the mandible, which we saw a little bit ago, you will see there this chunk of bone which was broken off of the left side of the mandible. You will note that we don't see any lead splatter in there. You'll see the scapula that we talked about a minute ago. This black area right here is the bone that's been broken away, and note the light area here. This is a fragment of the bullet that is attached to the debris on the outside, and you'll see a lot of other lead splatter on the scapula. Now let's move down now to the clavicle, which we looked at, and you can see there the break on the clavicle, and the cause of this break is probably that little light area there, which is a lead splatter again from a bullet that probably hit the clavicle hard enough to break the clavicle. Note the fracture of the right humerus here. This right humerus has been fractured, and you can see that as we go back up to the top. But before we get back to that, let's take a look at something that we found while cleaning off this individual. This is one of the bullets that was fired. You will note that it is deformed. but when we were cleaning out the inside of the skull and cleaning some of the debris off of the scapula, we found this deformed bullet. This is something that will be turned over to the law enforcement agents so that they can use it in ballistics tests, and we will work on things such as the age, race, and sex of the skeleton. Let's go back and take one last look at the skeleton, and you will note a fracture of the right humerus here, in which the bone is completely broken. You will see that the bone does fit together, but the bone is completely broken. There is no indication in here of lead fragments, and it looks like that this probably is a break due to a blow to the right arm. Now, this first lecture is going to cover the age of an individual. All of you know that we get older, and let me tell you a little story to begin with. Let's reach over here and pick up a femur. I want to tell you a little story about a femur. The femur is the bone in your upper leg. This is the part that fits at the hip. This is the area at the knee. Before I came to the University of Tennessee, which was 16 years ago, I taught at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. I assisted law enforcement agencies out there, and there was a farmer plowing in the Kansas River bottoms. As he came around, lying in the furrow where the plow had been the previous time, there was a bone. He stopped, he got off the tractor, he went out, picked up the bone, he looked at it, didn't know quite what to do with it, so he stuck it in the toolbox. And it was a little too big to get in the toolbox, so he went on and stuck it in the toolbox, but it stuck out. And you know how farmers are. They will stop at the fence and talk to their neighbors. And a day or two went by, and one of his neighbors stopped by, and they were talking. The neighbor looked over and saw this bone sticking out of the toolbox. They got out and they started discussing it. And the neighbor thought it was the bone of a mailman from Leavenworth, Kansas. Now, I don't know how he would know it was a mailman, going much further than I can go. And matter of fact, than anybody else can go to tell something like that. But they got excited, and they called the sheriff, and the sheriff brought the bone over to me and gave me this one bone and said, "Doc, who is it?" And I looked at it and I said, "Sheriff, it's an adult and it's not a child. It's a male, it's not a female. It's an American Indian. It's not Negroid or black or not Caucasoid or white, and I think the individual has been dead about 1,000 years." Now, he didn't know whether I was pulling his leg or not. Okay, how can you really go about telling things like this? Well, all of you know some of the criteria that we use. For example, you know that we as mammals have two sets of teeth. We have a deciduous or baby set of teeth, which is the first set of teeth we have, and then we have an adult set. Normally when you are born, and we're going to be talking about the average here, normally when you're born you do not have any teeth. When you reach 6 months, you begin to erupt this first set of teeth. And what we have here is the mandible of a child of about 2 years of age. Now, this is the central incisor. These two teeth, the left central and right central incisor, are the first two teeth to erupt. This is the lateral incisor. This is the deciduous or baby canine. This is the deciduous or baby first molar. And this is deciduous or baby second molar. Now, while we're focusing on that, note the hole in the mandible here. This hole is what is called the crypt for the first adult molar, and which will be the first adult tooth to erupt. And this hole right here is the crypt for the second molar tooth, which normally erupts at about age of 12 years. So what you have here is the central incisor, these two teeth right there, beginning to erupt at age 6 months. And by 24 months, all of the deciduous or baby teeth have erupted. The first deciduous molar normally erupts at about age 20 months, and this is followed by about 4 months later by the eruption of the second of the baby teeth. Now, one of the interesting things about teeth are that once the tooth has erupted, the baby tooth, that once a tooth has erupted and the root has formed, teeth do not get larger. But you know that as time goes by, that individuals get larger, and what you have here now are two mandibles, the one on your right being 2 years of age, and the one on your left being 5.5 years of age. Note that the one on your left is larger than the one on your right, And also note that there are spaces between the teeth here. This is where the mandible has grown. In other words, the bone has gone on to grow, and you can see my little stick there between the teeth. You can see the spaces that occur there. So what happens as the bones continues to grow, but the teeth don't grow, you begin to get spaces between the teeth. The reason for this is adult teeth are larger in size than are baby teeth, and you are then getting prepared for spaces in the mandible or in the tooth row for the larger teeth to occur. Again, your central incisor, which erupts at age 6 months, and then between 6 months and 24 months, the lateral incisor, the canine, and the first molar erupt. First deciduous molar erupting at, again, roughly about 20 months, and then the last of the deciduous teeth to erupt, the second molar, and this erupts at about age 24 months. Now, note the 6-year molar is in the process of erupting. You will note there that it has not reached the occlusal plane, the occlusal plane being the biting plane of the teeth, and what you have occurring is this individual dying at roughly about 5.5 years of age. Let's just go now to one that is a little bit older than this, show you what happens. Starting at about 6.5, you begin to replace the deciduous teeth. These are being replaced by the adult teeth. And on your right now, this would be an individual about 5.5 years of age. And this is an individual about 7 years of age. Note that there are no deciduous or baby incisors. These have been lost, and the adult teeth are down in there beginning to erupt. Note that you have the deciduous first molar and the deciduous second molar, and there is the adult first molar, or what is known as the 6-year molar. Now while we're looking at that, let me just take a quicker look at this and show you the difference between deciduous and baby teeth. Note that the deciduous molar is smaller than the adult molar. You may be able to note also that the deciduous molar is more yellow in color than is the adult molar. The adult molar is whiter. The reason for this is that in deciduous teeth, the enamel covering the dentine, the surface that you bite on is the enamel, and the material underneath the enamel is known as the dentine. The dentine is darker in color than is the enamel, and baby teeth do not have as thick enamel layer, and therefore baby teeth will appear more yellow in color than will the adult tooth. This is then the 12-year molar that will erupt a little bit later on, in other words, in about 4 or 5 more years. And finally, you replace all of your deciduous teeth with the adult teeth, and here you have a complete set of adult dentition. This is, all of these are adult. There are no deciduous teeth remaining at this age. The central incisor, the lateral incisor, the canine, the first premolar, the second premolar, the first molar, or what is known as the 6-year molar, the second molar, or what is known as the 12-year molar, and the third molar, or what is called the wisdom tooth, which normally erupts at about age 18, but genetically is a very unstable tooth, and it can erupt at any time. Now, while we're here, let me show you one other thing that will help you in your observation of material. This happens to be the mandible of an American Indian, and American Indians ate a lot of grit and dirt in their diet. Therefore, you have differential wear occurring on the occlusal surface. In other words, as you eat more grit and dirt, you begin to wear off the teeth, and you can see there, you may be able to see the occlusal surface of the 6-year molar. You can see some dark areas right there. This is where the enamel has been worn off and the dentine is showing through. Note that there's more wear on the 6-year molar than there is on the 12-year molar. In other words, this tooth has been used 6 years longer than is this tooth. And note that there is very little wear on the 3rd molar. This is the wisdom tooth, or is coming at 18. and has had 12 years less wear than the first molar and has had 6 years less wear than the second molar. So, one of the best ways of determining the age of a child up to certainly 12 and possibly 18 years of age is to look at the teeth and see whether they are deciduous or adults, and you are able then to get a very accurate age of the individual up to certainly 12, and depending on whether the third molars erupted 18, up to 18 years of age. All right, let's go to another criteria that we need to look at. These are known as epiphyses. I don't know how many of you have ever thought about this or not, but when you were born, you weighed roughly 6 to 10 pounds, and you were in length about 16 to 22 inches long. In a matter of 16 years, you can grow from the 6 to 10 pound infant, who are roughly 16 to 22 inches long, to, as an adult, if you are a female, are roughly 5 to 6 feet tall, or if you are a male, are roughly 5.5 to 6.5 feet tall. Or looking at it another way, you grow from this to this in only 16 years. These are the same bones. This is a femur of an infant that died at birth. The only difference between these two are a separation of approximately 16 years. Now, how can you grow from this to this in only 16 years? Well, you can do this because you grow at both ends of your bones at the same time. Now, let me go over here and show you some of the growth. We'll put this large bone down and pick up some of the other growing ones here. And this is a femur. This is when you wish you were an octopus so you could hold all these things. But this is the femur of an infant that died at birth. This is the femur of an individual that is about 2 years of age. Note that there's been considerable growth in the length of the bone. Now let's go get one that's about 3 years of age. There's an individual of about 3 years of age. And let's go on now. Let's get a little bit larger. Let's go on now up to about 10 years of age. This is 3, this is 10. And let me call your attention to something that is different. Note on the distal end of this bone, this would be the end where the knee is. Note that the end of the 3-year-old is rough, but note that the end of the 10-year-old is smooth. But note that I can pull that smooth end away from the bone, like that. Now, what I am pulling away from the bone is what is called the epiphysis. The epiphysis is the end of a long bone. Now, actually, it's a little more than the end of a long bone, but for our purposes right now, the epiphysis is the end of a long bone, and growth occurs at both the distal and proximal end of all of the long bones. This would be the bones in the upper arm, which is the humerus, the bones in the lower arm, which is the radius and the ulna, the bone in the upper leg, which is the femur, and the bone in the lower leg, which is the tibia and the fibula. Now, growth occurs in a line of cartilage. Cartilage is like your ear and your nose. There's a line of cartilage between the shaft and the epiphysis. And as you grow, growth occurs in that area of cartilage. Now, remember when you reached puberty, there was a circumpubertal spurt in growth, and you grew about 1 foot or more in 1 year, and then you slowed down and stopped growing? Why did you stop growing? Well, biologically, what happens is growth stops when the epiphyses unite to the shaft. Note again in the 10-year-old that the head of the femur, this is the part that fits into the innominate bone at the hip. Note that this is rough, but note that this is smooth, and note that I cannot pull that smooth end off of the bone. In other words, what has happened is we have now reached the stage at puberty where the epiphyses are beginning to unite. Look at the distal end of this, and you will note that the distal end is still open. I can still pull the distal end away from the shaft so that growth is still occurring in this individual. Let's go back to the top end here just a minute, and you will be able to see the line of union here where the epiphysis has just recently united to the shaft. You can see a line of union right there and a line of union right there, indicating then that the epiphyses have just united. Now, as you go through puberty, there is a circumpubertal spurt in growth where you grow very rapidly, And then when all the epiphyses unite onto the shaft, what you have then occurring is the bone like this. And note that both ends are attached. I cannot pull either end off of the bone. This then is an adult. Now the epiphyses for the femur usually unite, if it's a female, roughly 15 to 17, and if it's a boy, roughly 16 to 18, somewhere along in that range. Remember, let's go back to the first story I told you about the sheriff from Leavenworth County bringing over the femur. I looked at it and I said, Sheriff, it's an adult and not a child. You see what I was looking at? I was looking at the end of the bones to see if they were attached. Now, even though you may not know your anatomy, this bone right here is roughly, this is a human, but this is roughly the size of a femur of a fairly large dog. In other words, this would be a German Shepherd or a Collie or something like this. Now, even though you may not know your anatomy, you can get an idea of whether the individual is human or not. If you found this bone and the epiphyses were attached, in other words, the end of the bones were attached to the shaft, then you would know that that was probably not a human. It's possible it could be an achondroplastic dwarf, but that's very inconceivable, and I think that you would be aware that there was some other problems there. But if you found a bone like this and the epiphyses were attached, it very possibly would not be human. Then you would know that you were dealing with an animal instead of human. The human femur, size of the human femur, is the one here is the adult with the bones attached. Now, the last epiphysis of the body to unite is the sternal end of the clavicle. The clavicle is this bone right here. This is the bone that holds your arm out. Let's take a look at it on the skeleton back here. The clavicle is this bone right here that holds the arm out, comes in here and hooks onto the manubrium, or the sternum right here in the center line just below where the notch in your tie would be. Now the sternal end of the clavicle, this would be the end here that attaches to the sternum, is the last epiphysis of the body to unite. And let's us focus over here. I have a series of 4 clavicles to show you the closure of the epiphyses, and this epiphysis closes roughly at about age 25. There is some variability, but what you have here is the clavicle of an individual with no epiphyses attached. In other words, this is a rough surface. Now, this is the clavicle of an individual with just about half of the epiphyses attached to the bone. In other words, it was in the process of attaching when this individual died. And then this is a clavicle that is almost completely attached. You may be able to see the line of union right around the edge there. This would indicate that this individual died roughly at about age 23 to 25, somewhere along in that range. And then you have the adult clavicle in which the whole epiphysis has united to the bone, and it's all simply one bone. But the last epiphysis of the body to unite is the sternal end of the clavicle. If you wonder whether a skeleton is under 25 or over 25, look at this bone right here, the sternal end of the clavicle, or the clavicle. Look at the sternal end right here under where your tie would be, and there's a notch. If it is attached, it is over 25. If it is not attached, it is under 25. Okay, 2 good means now of telling the age of an individual in what we call the maturity indicators: the eruption of the teeth and the closure of the epiphyses. Most of you are not going to like what I'm going to tell you now, but biologically, you reach your peak at about age 19. If any of you looking at this tape are over 19, it's all downhill from here on. Now, fortunately, we don't go downhill quite as rapidly as we came up the hill, unless you abuse your body. And talking about abusing the body, before we get to that, let me show you something about abusing the body. All of you are spending time and taking these lectures because you're trying to learn a little bit more in order to do a better job. This, remember, is the femur. This is what your femur looks like. And you all are taking your time to learn a little bit more about the body, and we want you to remember to take good care of yourself, and let me show you what happens if you don't. The top bone is a heel fracture of the femur. The bottom bone, as you see, is the normal femur, and the bone on top is a femur that was broken and never set. What you have occurring here in the upper bone is a situation in which you have an overriding fracture right here. This is a fracture in which the two ends of the bones, you had the bone like this, and the bone breaks, and there are muscles and ligaments attached to it, so you get an overriding fracture, and this is exactly what you get in that situation right there. You also get the same thing occurring in this part of the bone with a slight splinter. You'll see a slight splinter running down, meaning that there was a little bit of torsion on that bone. Now, this was an individual who something happened, and he broke the femur, and he did not go have this set, and you can see that the bone healed in the broken position, and it was not set. Obviously, he was about 3 inches shorter on the right side. He would have made a great Indian in West Virginia. He could have walked around the hills just so long as he kept his right leg uphill. He'd have been all right, but he'd have to go all the way down the valley and back the other side in order to be able to keep his right leg uphill. Okay, now one of the things that we need to talk about now is some of the degenerative changes that occur in the body. In aging, you can look at two factors. One is the maturity indicators, and we've talked about two of these. We've talked about the eruption of the teeth and the closure of the epiphyses. These are things, as a body is maturing, these are what we call the growth or the maturity indicators. Now, once you have reached essentially 19 to 20, the system begins to wear out. It is a gradual wearing out of the skeleton, and you're beginning to look at these various things. We're going to talk about three of these in this lecture. The first of these we're going to talk about is what is known as the pubic symphysis. The pubic symphysis is where the two innominate bones come together in the front. This is a hip bone right here, or an innominate bone. The hip bone is the part of the pelvis. The pelvis, by the way, is made up of three bones. It's made up of two innominate bones and the sacrum. This is where the sacrum fits into the bone right there. If you want to, I'll tell you what we can do so that you can understand where this is. Let's get the spinal column here. The spinal column is the vertebra, and the vertebra rest upon what is known as the sacrum. The sacrum is one of the parts of the innominate bone that we have talked about just a minute ago. Now, the sacrum acts as a weight distributor. It essentially distributes weight from one column, which is the spinal column here. There's one column above the pelvis. It is a weight distributor distributing the weight out into two legs, and the pelvis then not only acts as a basin to hold all the material on the inside, but acts as a weight distributor. Where the white bone and the brown bone come together is the sacroiliac joint. Now, the reason there's a difference in the color here is because the sacrum, which is white, has been bleached. It's a biological supply house specimen. And the innominate over here, the brown bone, is one that came in from a police case, and this individual had been buried, and we cleaned it off but did not get all the dirt out of the little pores down in the bone, and this is what caused the bone to be brown. Now, what happens in this is that we want to look at the face of the pubic bone, or maybe we should just take 1 minute here to teach you just a little anatomy. Reach down by your side where your belt is, right here. Reach down by your side and you'll feel a bone. Be sure you feel your own now, not your neighbor's, because you can't be doing things like that. Okay, underneath the bone there, or underneath the belt, is the ridge of a bone, and what you're feeling there is the crest of the ilium. So this big fan-shaped portion of the bone is known as the ilium. Now take your bottom and wiggle it on the chair just a minute, and you'll wiggle, and you will find that you're sitting on two bones. You're sitting on your ischium, and that's what I'm holding the bone with right there. That is the second of the three parts of the innominate bone. Now the third part is the pubic portion, and this is this portion where the two bones come together to meet in the middle. Now, actually, up until puberty, up until roughly about 12 to 14 years of age, this bone is in three parts: the ilium, the ischium, and the pubic portion of the bone. Now, what we want to do is to look at the face of the pubic bone, and early in life, the face of the pubic bone is very rough, and you may be able to see that there. You may be able to see that this bone is very rough, and as you get older, it begins to smooth off. Essentially, what you are looking at is, if you want to think of it this way, early in life, the face of the pubic bone looks like a very rugged mountain chain with ridges and valleys, the ridges being the peaks and the valleys being the areas in between the peaks. Now, as you get older, essentially, the ridges begin to wear off, and the valleys begin to fill up, and what you have is a smooth surface. We can show this, I think, much better by going to an illustration, and we do have an illustration here to show the differences in the pubic bone. This is a view, or number one is a view of the pubic symphysis at age about 18 to 20. And essentially, the changes that occur, you will note that the roughness begins to appear, just like I described, and the face of the pubic symphysis becomes much more flat, or looking like a plains instead of a mountain and valleys. Continues on up into the 40s and early into the 50s here. By the time we reach the 50s and 60s, you're beginning to build up some sharp edges around the pubic symphysis. Once you get past about between 50 and 60, the use of the pubic symphysis is not a very good means of telling the age of an individual, because the changes are not as consistent as you would like for them to be. All right, I think that the illustrations there are more helpful in looking at the various changes that occur in the pubic symphysis from young individuals to older individuals. In summary, on the aging of the pubic symphysis, we have standards for both males and females. If you have an innominate bone, if you have the pubic symphysis, by comparing the face of the pubic bone to the standards that we have, we can tell you the age of an individual, say plus or minus 2 or 3 years, from say 18 to roughly about 50, maybe 60. Once you get past 60, the skeleton is changing such that the aging of the pubic symphysis is not as good as you would hope it would be. Okay, this is the first of the degenerative changes that we want to talk about. Now, the second of the degenerative changes that we want to talk about is what is known as osteone counting. I want to introduce you now to Steve Sims, who's one of my doctoral students. Steve is in charge of our osteone counting lab here at the University of Tennessee, and he frequently will look at thin sections of bones to determine the age of that individual.
One of the problems commonly confronted by forensic anthropologists is aging individuals, particularly when these individuals are over the age of 30 to 35 years. Because of this problem, Dr. Ellis Curley in 1965 developed a new method of aging called osteone counting. This technique utilizes the fact that bone is a living, restructuring organism all through an individual's life. Dr. Curley utilized different structures that do change with age and was able to estimate the rough age of an individual, no matter what the upper end of that range would be. Over here I have a bone ready to cut, and I'll start it. At the same time, I'll explain this technique of Dr. Curley's. He starts with a major bone of the leg. In this case, we have a femur. He also utilized a tibia or a fibula, in which you take a section from this bone, and in this case, I mount it on a diamond-embedded blade on a slow-speed saw. We make an initial cut, and this cut produces a slice of bone that is about 200 microns thick. From this point, I take the specimen and I grind it down to about 80 microns. I polish it, and then it is ready to mount microscopically on a slide, and it now is available for viewing under the microscope. This technique utilizes 4 different areas on any particular bone. Dr. Curley decided that it would be best to use 4 areas, which include the anterior, posterior, medial, and lateral sides of the bone. With these areas defined, Dr. Curley would look at a specimen under a microscope using 100 power and polarized light. With polarized light, you're able to look at the different structures, and in this case, Dr. Curley used 4 different structures for quantifying bone age. The 4 different structures can be broken down into formative bone, or circumferential lamellar bone and non-haversian canals, or the remodeling type of bone, which in this case is referred to as osteones or osteone fragments. It's the term osteone in which this technique called osteone counting gets its name. Dr. Curley knew ahead of time that these structures would either decrease or increase with age, and this is what he would do by looking at it under the microscope. As we put a specimen under the microscope, we can see the differences with advancing age. Here's an individual who was in his early 20s, and in this particular field you can see there are very few remodeling structures, the round structures with the concentric circles within these structures, very few remodeling structures in this field, but the formative structures, the original structures in the original formation of bone are still present, the circumferential lamellar bone and the non-haversian canals. If we go to the next slide, which is an individual in the mid-40s, you can see a change in frequency of structures. At this age, you're getting a higher frequency of bone remodeling structures. By bone remodeling structures, I'm talking about the osteones, and actually the osteone fragments. These are simply osteones that have been eaten through by newer osteones. If we remove this slide and stick a yet older individual in, this individual is in his mid-60s, and now you can see with ease that this individual is an older age individual because all you see in this field are osteones or osteone fragments. So this is a simple demonstration of how the bone histology changes with age. It is not easy to talk about osteone counting without considering the problems involved with this technique. As you can see, the first problem involved with this technique is that it is a destructive technique. You no longer have a complete bone once you have completed this technique. So it's something I always advise is to take all the measurements you can on the complete bone before you ever begin to cut. A second major problem I feel with this technique is, of course, the time and the effort and the equipment it takes to start with a specimen like this and end up with something you can view under the microscope. There obviously is equipment involved and a lot of manual time. I take a specimen that has been cut off, and I need to grind the specimen down to about 80 microns and then polish it very carefully so no scratches show up under the polarized light. The final problem involved with this technique, of course, involves the fact that you assume this specimen you're looking at under the microscope is a specimen representing a normal, healthy bone. If in fact this individual had suffered some sort of trauma or pathology, this may influence your osteone counting, in which case it may influence your final age. I'd highly recommend that you use osteone counting in conjunction with other skeletal aging techniques.
Okay, welcome back again to the third of the criteria we want to look at to determine the age of an older individual. And this is what is known as osteoarthritis. Osteoarthritis is a buildup of bone around a joint surface. There are many types of arthritis. If you are a lumper, you can lump these into 2 categories. One is called rheumatoid arthritis, and this is usually individuals who have large knuckles. The reason they have large knuckles is because of inflammation of the tissue around that knuckle, and what you're getting is an enlargement due to the inflammation. If you look at an individual who has rheumatoid arthritis, if you look at the bones look malty. They have little holes in them and so forth. But what we want to talk about is what is known as osteoarthritis, or a buildup of bone around a joint surface. Essentially what we're looking at here is a degenerative change of the skeleton. All individuals, all animals that have skeletons, if you live long enough, will begin to build up arthritic changes known as bony spurs or osteoarthritis, and this is something that is essentially common to all individuals with a skeleton, and the system is beginning to wear out. The best way of looking at this, I think, is to look at the vertebral column. Remember, we looked at a vertebral column before. This is a copy of the vertebra, or the vertebral column. Remember, the upper 7 of these is the neck area. This is what is known as the cervical vertebra. The next 12 are known as the thoracic vertebra. It is to these that the ribs attach. And the bottom 5 of these are known as the lumbar vertebra. Note that these increase in size as you go from the cervical or the neck region through the thoracic into the lumbar. They increase in size. The reason for this is that they are supporting more weight as you go down in the column, and therefore you need a larger bone to support the weight. Now, let's take a look at just some of at a separate one of these, and we'll put this down. We have some separate ones right here. And let's start off by showing a subadult bone. Remember, we talked about epiphyses, and we said that epiphyses were the ends of long bones. Well, not only long bones have epiphyses, but there is a ring that fits around the outside of the vertebral body. This is what's called a centrum. By the way, this is where the spinal cord goes down through the hole in the bone right there. But note that the epiphyseal ring is not attached. In other words, this is a young individual, and you will see it has nice, smooth, rounded edges on the bone. Now let's get an individual that is a little bit older. Here we have an individual in which the epiphyseal rings have attached, and you will see there the ring, and you cannot see the billowing that occurs when the ring is not there. And this is an individual that, note, has nice smooth edges around the edge of that bone right there. Now, let's go to another one and show you. We're holding this in the same plane. And note all of this jagged material around the edge of that bone right there. This is what is known as osteoarthritis. All of this jagged material around the edge of that bone is a buildup of bone around the joint surface due to a wearing out of the system. Now, there are 2 of these bones that fit together. You can see there how these 2 bones fit together. And this material around the outside there is what is known as osteoarthritis. All of this jagged material around the outside edge there is something that you get as you get older. Now, it is true that trauma can cause a buildup of this. In other words, you may fall down and damage an elbow. You don't break the elbow, but it hurts, and as time goes by, you begin to notice that it hurts more and more. If you look at that elbow, you're going to begin to find these bony spurs, or what is known as osteoarthritis, beginning to appear. If you look at the opposite elbow, it will not be there. This is because of the trauma that has occurred, and this is one of the reasons that you need the entire skeleton. You need to look at all of the joint surfaces to see whether the amount of osteoarthritis which is occurring is spread roughly evenly throughout the skeleton, or whether it is due to a traumatic situation in which you have damaged some of the surrounding tissue to the joint surface. Now, what can you do about this? Well, there's not a whole lot you can do about it, really. You can go in and surgically remove this material. However, it tends to grow back. So that what happens in situations like this is many older people move to the south, particularly to the desert Southwest and Arizona and New Mexico, because this does not hurt as much in a dry climate, dry and warm. It hurts a little bit more in a dry and moist climate. This would be Florida, for example. However, it does not hurt nearly as much as it does if you are cold and damp, which is the type of climatic condition that we have in much of the northeastern and northern part of the United States. What people are doing when they move to the desert Southwest or to Florida in the wintertime, they're not doing anything for the osteoarthritis. What they're doing is helping the symptoms of the individual, or the symptoms and the pain that occurs. You heard the story of the city boy and the country boy that went in the army together, and the city boy got a letter from his wife saying that she was in bed with arthritis. The country boy said, my, said, that was terrible. Said, he knew all them rightous boys, and Arthur was the worst one of them. Well, with that, we'll put these down and see if we can't now summarize just a little bit. We'll summarize the aging processes that we've talked about. When you're trying to determine the age of a skeleton that comes in, what you're looking for are either the maturity indicators, the eruption of the teeth, the closure of the epiphyses. If it is an adult and all the epiphyses are closed, with the last epiphysis to unite, being the sternal limb of the clavicle, at roughly about age 25, you need to then to begin to look at degenerative changes. These are the changes in the pubic symphysis that we've talked about. In osteone counting, how you can determine the changes in the internal structure of the bone, and the amount of osteoarthritic lipping that is built up. In determining age from osteoarthritic lipping, we can tell the age roughly in a plus or minus 10 year, or you can put it in decades, like in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, depending on what you're looking at. Now, these are subtle changes that occur in the skeleton. It takes a long time and a lot of research in order to be able to interpret these changes that you see in the skeleton. This is why an anthropologist is important in the human identification chain. The anthropologist is essentially the last man in the identification chain, and if nobody else can identify the individual, the anthropologist, through the techniques that have been learned over many, many years of looking at our ancestors through time, have been able to build up a series of criteria by which they can aid law enforcement agents in determining of the age, the race, the sex of a skeleton. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you. Hi, let me welcome you to the second of 4 lectures dealing with techniques in determining the age, race, and sex of the human skeleton. If you remember in the first lecture, we talked about determining the age of the individual at the time of death. Today we're going to be talking about the sex of the individual, how you determine whether the skeleton is a male or a man or a woman. Let's go back just a minute and review some of the techniques that we used in the first lecture. If you remember in talking about the age of the skeleton, you can literally look at any part of the body depending on how old the individual is. For example, if you have a subadult individual, a person say below
18 to 20 years of age, you can look at two major criteria: the eruption of the teeth and the closure of the epiphyses. Now, if you have an adult skeleton, what you want to do is to begin to look at the degenerative changes of the body. The changes that occur, for example, in the pubic symphysis, the changes that occur in the internal structure of the bone, what is known as osteone counting, and then as you get later on in life, the degenerative changes of the skeleton, which can best be seen by what is known as osteoarthritis, or a buildup of bone around a joint surface. I don't know how many of you have ever taken a course in anthropology, but I think that all of you have noted that women have broader hips than do males. If you've not noticed this, go notice it. It's an exciting experiment, and you can do it in the name of science. Now, the best area then to tell the sex of an individual is from the pelvis. When in doubt, always look at the pelvis. Sometimes you don't have the pelvis, and we'll talk about other means of determining sex in this lecture, but let's start with the area that gives us the best results in determining whether a person is a man or a woman. Let's go now to a model of the pelvis. We have here a model of a human pelvis, and your pelvis is made up of three different bones. It is made up of the sacrum, which is the bone at the base of the spinal cord. It is made up of two hip bones, the right hip bone, or what is known as the right innominate, and the left hip bone, or the left innominate, and you can see here the top of the femurs that are articulated with the innominate bone. Now let's go to, before we get into a more specific discussion of the anatomy of this, let's go back and give you separate pieces of the skeleton to show you how the pelvis is put together. All of you know that the spinal cord is that part of the skeleton which connects your skull to the rest of the postcranial skeleton. This is a spinal column. Remember that the top 7 vertebrae are known as cervical vertebrae. These are the ones that are in the neck. The next 12 are the ones to which the ribs attach, and these are known as the thoracic vertebrae. And then the bottom 5 are known as lumbar vertebrae. These are the ones at the base of the spinal column, and you will note that they are larger in size than are either the thoracic or the cervical vertebrae. The reason for this is that as you go down in the body, it needs to support more weight, and therefore the heavier bones are at the bottom. Now, the spinal column ends in what is known as the sacrum, and this is a separate sacrum, and you can see how the sacrum fits on the bottom of the spinal column right there. Let me get it so it fits a little bit better there. There we go. Now you can see how the sacrum. Now the sacrum acts as a weight distributor. It essentially distributes weight from one column, which is the spinal column, out into two columns, which would be both legs. And therefore, the sacrum then distributes weight into the right innominate and the left innominate. Now let's get a separate innominate. Here we have a left innominate bone, and you can see how the sacrum fits in to the pelvis right there. And in this case, we have skeletal material that is of different color. You see that the sacrum is whiter in color. That is because it has been bleached. And the right innominate or hip bone here is one from an archaeological site, and it has dirt down in the bone, and we didn't get all the dirt out of it. But essentially, where the white bone and the dark bone articulate means to join, where they join or articulate is the sacroiliac joint. Now, let's take this bone right here and talk a little bit about this. And up until about puberty, if you remember back again on aging, when the epiphyses were uniting, one of the things that we need to remember is that there are other things occurring in the aging process other than just the closure of the epiphyses, and one of those is the closure of 3 bones, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, in order to make a separate innominate bone. Early in life, or say up to puberty, say 13 to 16 years of age, this bone is in 3 different parts. Now reach down by your side where your belt would be, right here, and under your belt you will be able to feel a bone. Go ahead and feel it, it's there. Okay, what you're feeling is the crest of the ilium. This is this bone right here. And you're feeling the iliac crest, or the crest of the bone that is known as the ilium. Now, take your bottom and wiggle it a little bit on the chair, and you will find that you're sitting on two bones. You're sitting on your ischium. You might have thought you're sitting on something else, but in all honesty, you're sitting on your ischium, and if this is not there, you're just a blob of tissue oozing off of the chair, because this is what is holding you up. Now, you can't feel this while you're sitting down, but when you think about this later on, note this bone here that I'm pointing to. This is the pubic portion of the bone. This is the third part of the innominate bone. We have the ilium. I'm holding this with the ischium and pointing to the pubic bone. When you get out of this lecture, if you want to try this, punch in on your tummy, and about 4 inches below your navel, you're going to run into a bone, and that will be the pubic bone. Remember, we talked about the pubic symphysis and the pubic symphysis in the aging process. This is the pubic symphysis, which is the face of the pubic bone that we talked about and showed you illustrations in the last lecture. What we want to do now is to take the same bone that we talked about in the aging process, and we want to begin to show you the differences that occur between males and females. Essentially, what happens is this. A female has a broader pelvis because she gets width in the pelvis in 3 different areas of the innominate bone. Now let's go and get 2 innominates here. What we have is an innominate of a male and an innominate of a female. Now, what I'd like to call your attention to is the length of the pubic bone in a male is short, and the length of the pubic bone in a female is long. Note that the length of the pubic bone in the male is a short pubic bone, and that the length of the pubic bone in the female is long. You can look at this another way, by the way, by, if you have an innominate bone, by taking your finger and putting it against the pubic symphysis, and note that my thumb is right against the bone. Note that I cannot wiggle my thumb in this male pelvis. A male has a short pubic bone. Now let's try the same thing in the female. Put that down and get the female bone, and you will note there that the female has a long pubic bone, and note that my thumb does not even touch the bone. In other words, one of the areas where a female gets width in the pelvis is a longer pubic portion of the bone, and therefore a wider subpubic angle. Now let's go to a second criteria that we would like to show you. In the female, again trying to get width in the pelvis, this notch here in the bone between the ischium, which I'm holding it, and the ilium up here, this notch in the bone is known as the sciatic notch. Now note in a female, if I put my thumb in the sciatic notch, that I can wiggle my finger from side to side. In other words, a female has a broad sciatic notch. Now let's look now at the same structure in the male, and you will note that a male has a narrow notch. Note when I put my thumb in the notch in the male that I cannot wiggle my finger from side to side, or my thumb, and therefore you have a narrow notch, and this is very characteristic of males. Now let's look at the third area where you get differences between a female and a male in the pelvic area. We want to look now at the sacroiliac joint. Remember again, we had the sacrum. Let's get the sacrum back so you'll remember this. Where the white bone and the brown bone come together, that is the sacroiliac joint. This joint surface right down through here. Now, this is the surface that you want to look at for the third of the criteria we're going to use. And let's hold the bone in this direction so that you can see across it. And I want to show you that you can take a pencil or a probe and you can run it across the sacroiliac joint in a male. In other words, there is a very flat surface between the sacrum and the innominate in the male. Now let's look at that same structure in the female, and you will see that there's a buildup of bone in the sacroiliac joint in the female. And if we go back to the same position that we had it before, where you're looking essentially across the sacroiliac joint right here, note that I cannot get my probe across the sacroiliac articulation because of a buildup of bone in the sacroiliac joint. what this is doing essentially is pushing the anominates further apart so that you are getting width in the pelvis. In summary now, the difference between a male pelvis and a female pelvis is essentially in the width that occurs. A female has a longer pubic bone. A female has a wider sciatic notch. And a female has a buildup of bone in the sacroiliac articulation, which is right there. This is what causes a female to have broader hips. Now I'm going to walk over here in just a minute and show you some differences that occur between the way males and females stand. And so if you're ever on a stakeout trying to watch people getting out of town or something like this, and you see some of these characteristics, you'll understand what is happening. And if there's somebody dressed up in clothing of the opposite sex, you can understand what these differences are going to be. Let's show you how an anominate fits on to the pelvis. There is the head of the femur, and note that the head of the femur fits into what is called the acetabulum, which is that hole right there. You can see how the head of the femur fits into the acetabulum, and when you walk, this moves, as you can see right there. Now, let's move over and let me show you the difference between how males and how females stand. Note that as I stand, I am locking both knees in place. If you were to watch a female stand, you would note that she would kick one leg out of place. Now the reason for this is that a female having a broader pelvis, in a male, the anominate hangs roughly straight down below the hip bone like this. Now if you broaden the anominate, or broaden the pelvis, note that I'm broadening the pelvis. Note that the femur has to incline at a greater angle under the anominate bone. Again, this is the way it is in the male. And note that as I broaden the hip, the femur inclines at a greater angle under the anominate bone. If it didn't, if in a male, if you broaden the hip like this, then women will walk around like this, and you can see that there is a difference here. Let me show you a couple of things that you need to be watchful for, particularly if you're ever on a stakeout watching people at a bus station, a train station, or an airport, and somebody trying to leave town masquerading in the clothing of the opposite sex. We just talked about how individuals stand, and let me show you another characteristic about a carrying angle. If you've noticed, males carry their books down on their side like this. If you watch females, females carry their books up like this. Now, the difference is because of the width of the pelvis. If females carried their books down on the side, their books would be way out here on the side like this, and this would be uncomfortable. So what they do is they compensate for this by bending their arm and carrying their books up like this. If any of you are ever on a stakeout, or watching people, if you find a female, or let me say it another way, if you find a male who is standing with one leg out of, bent and holding books like this, you need to check this out more carefully, because what I think you may have is somebody who is dressed up as a male. In other words, you would have a female dressed up as a male trying to get out of town without you noticing who they are. Now these are things that we can change clothing, but these are anatomical features that are very difficult to cover up. Okay, in summary now, the best area to tell the sex of an individual is from the pelvis. Now the second best area to tell the sex of an individual is from the skull. And let's go now and look at some of the skulls that we have. And let me introduce you to this individual. This is a Negro woman. This was a human identification case that came in about 25 years ago through the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. And this individual was shot in the chest and buried in a shallow grave. And when we identified her, the family did not want to bury this individual, so we kept her in the anatomical collection. Now, I don't know where you all have gone to NEC. All of you are taking this course come from all over the United States, and so you could be anywhere. But a little biological determinism. Remember how you used to go out and rub your girlfriend's head and so forth like this? A little biological determinism there, because Females have a nice, smooth, gracile skull. It's like caressing a Georgia peach, you know. It's exciting. If you think back, by the way, let's go get a male skull here. If you think back, the girls didn't run their fingers through your hair very much. This, by the way, isn't a male. This is a Mongoloid individual, basically the same as American Indians, or Japanese, or Chinese. And if you remember, the girls didn't run their fingers through your hair very much. The reason is because males have a lumpy and bumpy skull. What we're looking at in a male are heavy supraorbital ridges. These ridges across the eye orbits. Note also that males have a large mastoid process. This is the area back of the ear being right here. This is the mastoid process, is larger in males than it is in females. Note the muscle markings on the back of the skull. This is where the muscles of the neck attach, and of course the larger the muscles you have, the larger are the foundations, the foundation being the bones, and so you have ridges on the bones. So that males have a larger skull, a more rugged skull, larger mastoid processes, heavy supraorbital ridges. Now something that's going to be a little more difficult to show, but let's see if we can't. If you will take a skull and feel the upper edge of the eye orbit. Now you can't feel this on yourself because there's tissue there and your eyeball's in the way, but if you have a skull, if you will feel the upper edge of the eye orbit, in a male that will be a blunt surface. In a female, it will be a sharp surface. You will have a sharp, almost a knife edge along the upper edge of the eye orbit. That's not a bad criteria, by the way, and it's something that you can take a look at. Now, let me show you another criteria. Let's go to get both skulls here. This will be then a male here and a female here, and you will note there that, contrary to popular opinion, a female has a smaller mouth than does a male, or saying it positively, a male, which is this one, has a larger mouth than does the female, which is this one. Now let's go to a criteria which is pretty good for telling the sex of a skull, of looking at the mandibles. Let me put these two skulls down, and we will go to the mandible, or what is known as the lower jaw. And a very good criteria that I have found works fairly well. We're going to hold these mandibles. This is the way the jaw is. And you hold the mandible up like this so that you can look at the chin. And note that a male has a square chin. A male has a chin that comes to a point in a square. And note that a female has a point, or a chin that comes to a point in the midline with a point. And I think that you can see that pretty well, where a female has a pointed chin and the male has a square chin there. And that is a characteristic that I think that you will find occurring in many of the skeletons that you may come across in your criminal investigation. All right? The second best area to tell the sex of a skeleton is from the skull. Best area is the pelvis. Second best area is the skull. Now, let me introduce you to a big term known as sexual dimorphism, which is a fancy term which simply means that males are larger than are females. The reason for this is that females reach puberty 2 years sooner than do boys. If you who are females remember when you were in the 6th or 7th grade, you were beginning to reach puberty, or there were some other girls in the class reaching puberty, and you were beginning to worry, but it wasn't going to happen to you, and finally you reached puberty. And you then were interested in the 8th and 9th grade boys. You weren't interested in the 6th or 7th grade boys because they were out there going like this. They were playing cops and robbers. And you notice that some of them have never gotten out of that stage of playing cops and robbers. But essentially, what's happened is girls reach puberty 2 years sooner than do boys. Remember from the aging lecture that we had, when you reach puberty, there's a rapid growth, and growth stops when the epiphyses unite to the diaphysis. This occurs in females 2 years sooner than it does in boys. Boys reach puberty, but they reach puberty 2 years later than do girls. Therefore, boys grow 2 years longer than do girls, and they end up then, in general, taller than do girls. Now let me show you a characteristic or criteria that we can use to show this. This is, by the way, not the best criteria to use because there's still some growth occurring in this bone. If you remember the epiphysis that is separated here, there's still some growth occurring in that bone. But if I set these two bones together like that on the table, you will note that the one on your right is larger than the one on your left. All other things being equal, this is a male and this is a female. But you have to be careful because sexual dimorphism is something that is not always as good as it could be. As you know, there are some large females and there are some small males. If they died and you buried them in the same grave, using size differences, or again what is known as sexual dimorphism, you could get these things mixed up. But let me show you a criteria that does work. Let's go and look at the head, close-up of the head of these two bones. Look at the head of the femur, and you will note that the head of the femur here is larger than the head of the femur here. All other things being equal, if you measure the maximum diameter of the head, if it is 43 millimeters or less, this would be this one. If it's 43 millimeters or less, it is a female. If it is 45 millimeters or greater, it is then a male. Now, you may wonder what happens if it's 44, and indeed, an awful lot of them are. What you've got to do is to look at other criteria. Essentially, though, one of the best ways of sorting out sexual dimorphism or size difference is not only looking at the size of the bones, but measuring the maximum diameter of the head of the femur, and this will give you some indication of whether the individual was a male or a female. Now, let's summarize what we have just talked about and on how you determine the sex of a human skeleton. Whereas in age, you can look at any part of the skeleton depending on how old the individual is. In sex, the best area to look at is the pelvis. If you don't have the pelvis, you're somewhat hard put. Let me say, by the way, that there are 208 bones in the adult human skeleton. When I first started working in law enforcement 30-some years ago, one of the questions that police often ask is, how many bones do you want us to bring in? It's very much like a puzzle with 208 pieces in that puzzle, and that puzzle is a picture of a scene. Let's say it's a scene of a log cabin along a lake in the mountains. If I give you one piece of that picture and ask you, what is that picture? It's going to be much more difficult for you to tell me that than if I gave you all 208 pieces of that skeleton. So, if you have a skeleton, every bone is important. You want to bring in every bone that you can, because you want to look at all parts of the skeleton to see if these things are occurring. The things that we've talked about in the aging and in determining the sex. If you give me the entire skeleton, 208 bones, we in anthropology can determine roughly about 96% accuracy of 100 skeletons, or saying it another way, that we can determine sex in about 96% of the individuals. There are about 4% of the population, people like Christine Jurgensen or Renee Richards, which fall in that overlap between the morphological or anatomical features between the male and the female, and it is difficult to determine. I had a case one time from Easton, Pennsylvania. A hunter was out hunting, and the dog stopped to sniff a skeleton, and or to sniff something. The hunter went over, and it was a skeleton. They called the state police. The state police called a mortician. The mortuary brought in the bones. Dr. Krogman, who's the man I got my doctoral degree from, looked at the material, and I was a graduate student at that time. He let me look at it. This is how we did these things. We both looked at them. He made his decision, I made my decision, and then we talked about why we were correct, and more specifically, why we differed in a case. And in this particular case, both of us would have testified in court that this individual was a male, except for one thing. The individual was 5 months pregnant at the time of death. Now, here was a skeleton that had all of the criteria of a male, but because there was a fetus in the abdominal cavity, about a 5-month-old fetus, you know it could not have been a male. So there are some individuals that overlap, and these things are not 100%. You should be aware of that. However, remember that in about 96% of the cases, we can determine the sex of an individual. The best area, again, is in the summary of sex, the best area to determine sex is from the pelvis. Look at the length of the pubic bone, look at the width of the sciatic notch, and by the way of the criteria that we talked about, the width of the sciatic notch is not the best. I have seen in skeletons wide sciatic notches in males, although I've never seen a real narrow sciatic notch in a woman. But I think you can get wide sciatic notches not only in females but in males. Also look at the buildup of bone along the sacroiliac articulation. Going to the skull, you're looking at a lot of things. You're looking at essentially the robusticity of the skull. Is the skull gracile or small and smooth and delicate? It would be a female. If it's more robust, if it's more rugged, if it has heavy supraorbital ridges, if it has heavy muscle markings, it is a male. Look at the chin. If the chin comes to a point in the midline, it's a female. If it is a square chin, then it is a male. And then you can look at any of the other long bones. Taking the bones and looking at them, you can determine whether if it is a large individual, it is very possibly a male. If it is a small individual, it is very possibly a woman. The reason for this is what is known as sexual dimorphism, where you have males growing 2 years longer than women, and therefore, in general, males end up larger than our girls, or boys end up larger than girls. And you can look at the diameter of the head of the femur, and this is an indication, again, of size, but size is not the best. Remember that the best area to tell the sex of an individual is from the pelvis. Thank you very much for being with us with this lecture on how to determine the sex of a human skeleton. Thank you.